Drones far away from the front lines in Ukraine increasingly striking Crimea and even Moscow. Is the Russian position becoming more vulnerable? Are Russians getting tired?
The main question which is existing in the Russian society today is why so long? Why so long? Where is the great Russian army, which was described many times as one of the best in the world?
Andrei Fedorov is a former deputy foreign minister of Russia. He's my guest this week on Conflict Zone, joining us from Moscow. How much should the West be concerned about Putin cozying up with North Korea? Is Putin out of options?
Of course, there is a danger. There is a danger of the nuclear war on Korean peninsula.
And with more evidence of Russian atrocities in Ukraine, who will be held accountable? Andrei Fedorov, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you.
Investigations by the UN have been documenting further evidence of Russian war crimes in Ukraine, including willful killings, attacks on civilians, unlawful confinement, torture, rape, forced transfers, and deportations of children. When you were on this program last year, you were asked if you were personally ashamed of what Russian soldiers are doing to civilians in Ukraine. You said that you didn't have a real picture of what was going on. With the picture of brutality now becoming even clearer, are you ashamed?
It's war. It's war. It's a serious war. And of course, there are some cases which can be considered as a real brutality. But it's war. Unfortunately, this war lasts too long. Now it's 572 days. And the problem is that this war is becoming more and more brutal. And what is more important, there is clear understanding on the both sides that it will last rather long. And that's why it creates additional problems. I mean, the problems that Russia...
But Mr. Fedorov, what about the Ukrainian children taken to Russia, for example? I mean, Kyiv says it has identified almost 20,000. Russia has refused to provide information about the children or even work with a neutral intermediary such as the Red Cross to register and repatriate them. Are those children lost forever?
No, they're not lost. There is a request for Ukrainian side to identify the children which should be returned to their parents, etc., etc. But of course, it's still the question which needs most probably outside assistance, because the direct contacts between Russia and Ukraine are now on the zero level, and we are facing a lot of problems with this. And of course, this question is important for Russia because of the decision of the International Criminal Court, and we would like to clarify these things.
But Russia has,
as far as I know,
Russia has been blocking that outside assistance, Mr. Fedorov. And in fact, as it's doing so, it is also targeting or appearing to target civilians in Ukraine, schools, markets, residences. The United Nations saying that those attacks have been indiscriminate and disproportionate. And in fact, after an official visit to Ukraine this month, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture said that Russia's armed aggression is becoming synonymous with torture and other inhumane cruelty, saying, quote, "These grievous acts appear neither random nor incidental, but rather orchestrated as part of a state policy to intimidate, instill fear, punish, and extract information and confessions." Who should be held accountable for these grievous acts?
Oh, this is a very hard question, because what is a problem today? The problem today is that Russian army is in defense position. Russian army cannot start its own offensive operation. And that's why the key point is to increase strikes on Ukraine with missiles, with drones, etc. And of course, such kind of strikes will damage both civilian and transport infrastructure, various things, and will cause additional casualties, especially I think it will be visible in the coming couple of months because the war is now turning more into a position war, and strikes, missile strikes, will be the main element of the war.
But we're talking here about accountability for what the UN describes as apparent disregard for civilian harm and suffering. What about accountability right at the top? What about Putin? There's an ICC investigation, an arrest warrant for war crimes already issued, including for both Putin and Russia's children's commissioner, accusing them of personal responsibility for the abductions of children from Ukraine. Does anyone care?
In Russia, frankly speaking, no one cares too much. And Russia is ignoring the warrant by International Criminal Court. And though, of course, Putin didn't went to South Africa to bring summit because of this warrant, and now there is a big quarrel about this warrant with Armenia, which will ratify Rome Statute. But inside Russia, there is no such kind of feeling that Russia is guilty.
I'd like to come back to accountability, but first, let's talk a little bit more about Ukraine's counter-offensive. The latest attacks in Russian-occupied Crimea in the port of Sevastopol appears to be the largest on the Russian Black Sea Fleet base and the first known strike on a Russian submarine in the conflict. Ukraine is trying to cut off Russian troops from supply lines. Russian troops are becoming more vulnerable here, aren't they?
The question is very simple. What's going on there? I can tell you that the biggest problem for Russia today is that Russia is in defense. And this influence on many political decisions here as well as military decisions. For us, the problem is that Ukraine is receiving new effective weapons. And personally, I'm more than sure that somewhere in November, German Taurus missiles will come to Ukraine. I see no problems for this. This is, from my personal view, on the way. And of course, this is making Kremlin much more nervous because the strikes are touching not only Crimea, but they're touching different parts of Russia, including Moscow. Drones attacks on Moscow nearly every day. On Moscow region nearly every day. So this is changing the nature. And the problem is that Russia can answer such kind of challenge not by offensive operation on the ground, but only with a heavy missile attack.
You have some pro-Telegram channels raising concerns over the Ukrainian counter-offensive, describing a difficult situation at the front. Successful attacks in Crimea, they're a blow to Russia. In the past days, Ukraine also saying that it has retaken villages around Bakhmut. How are these moves viewed inside Russia? Does the general public hear of them at all?
No, general public here, but of course, official propaganda is very effective here, saying that everything is okay, there is no damage for Russia, etc., etc. Reality is that the main question which is existing in the Russian society today is why so long? Why so long? Where is the great Russian army, which was described many times as one of the best in the world? And of course, officially, of course, there is a position that Ukrainian offensive is a big failure. But I know also a point of view from my Ukrainian colleagues who are saying, no, yes, we didn't reach too much, but we stopped Russian army moving forward.
So,
Army Russia lost initiative. So for Ukraine, it's the best is to understand how to act next year.
If Russians are asking why so long, what do they also think when they're hearing and seeing more drone strikes inside Russia itself, including in Moscow, where there are reports of drones frequently causing flight delays and even damage? That must be unsettling to civilians, isn't it?
Of course, it makes Russian civilians much more nervous. First of all, because of the drone attacks, including attacks on Moscow and Moscow region. There is nearly every day delays of the flights in the morning from all the Moscow airports. And of course, it creates a problem. It creates a question. It creates also questions concerning our air defense, our anti-missile defense. And many people are asking about how we should think about possibility to be secured in the future. Also, one of the top questions, which is still unanswered, is a number of the losses of Russian army in the region, in the conflict, and the Ministry of Defense is keeping it as a biggest secret.
But when we look at the general philosophy, I mean, President Volodymyr Zelensky has described the strikes as just and fair and a way to bring the war home to Russia. Does he have a point? Putin invaded his country in a war of choice.
It's his strategy. It's his strategy. And of course, for Russian citizens, strikes, for example, against Moscow is in some case much more important than situation on the front line. Yes, this is a question. This is a question. And the problem is that Russia officially is not considering this situation as a war against Ukraine. Formally, it's called special military operation. And this is a kind of funny story, because special military operation, in which we are using even hypersonic missiles, looks much more as a real war. And from this point of view, some of the arguments on the Russian TV, on the Russian mass media, that it's not the war, it's Ukraine which is in war with Russia, but not Russia is in war. Officially, Russia is not in war with Ukraine.
Let's talk a little bit more about the stifling of free speech and dissent, because Amnesty has reported some 20,000 people in Russia have been the target of repressive laws to suppress the country's anti-war movement. A sign of desperation from the Kremlin, concern about dissent, especially with elections approaching next year? I mean, because if they can't build support for the war, crush dissent? Is that what this is?
You're right that there were a lot of legislative acts have been adopted during last year. And for example, on foreign agents, it was adopted even before the war started. Of course, there are a lot of cases when people are not allowed to express their opinion against military activities. And this is very strict control over the mass media on this issue.
But it's deeper than that, isn't it? Because, I mean, the United Nations, in a recent report just released this week, described a systemic crackdown on civil society. There are these reports of a so-called reawakening of totalitarian instincts in Russian society, with people informing on each other, like in the Stalin era. The opposition, of course, is silenced, jailed, or in exile. What kind of Russian society do you think emerges from this war?
First of all, I would like to say that political opposition to Putin is simply totally destroyed. There is no political opposition to Putin anymore. And I don't think that there will be. It's not possible in this current situation. Concerning the coming presidential elections, which might take place in March next year, I see no problems for Putin. I see no problems. The problem is only turnover, because as far as I know, quite many people are saying that in this situation, they simply don't want to go and vote. So they will not say that they're against Putin or against war, but they will just try to express their point of view by non-voting. But as I said, I see absolutely no problems for Putin to be re-elected spring next year. Absolutely no problems.
Let's talk a little bit more about opposition. And I'd like to turn to Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was able to march a column of tanks within miles of Moscow, kill about a dozen Russian airmen, call Russia's stated reasons for invading Ukraine false. He has this sort of cultish following, and it's thought support from both the public and inside the military. And then his plane falls out of the sky. Do you think that was an accident?
Personally, I think that it was not an accident. I knew this man for many years. But I would like to stress that what has happened is very interesting. During his 3 days of appearance, he never said that he wants to change president. What was his call, and I spoke later on with my friends from Wagner, is to change military strategy in Ukraine. To understand, he wanted our military command to understand that it's a new, modern type of war, the war, which is totally different from the images of Second World War. And that's why he was accusing, first of all, military command, Minister of Defense, head of the General Staff, as non-capable to understand the realities of the modern war. And of course, he has some serious personal conflicts with a number of the people in Russian elite. Personally, I don't think it was accident, because even the fact that it has happened just 2 months, strictly 2 months after his statement, first statement, so it is.
Does the Kremlin expect people, you think, to believe that it was just a coincidence that months after staging that uprising, he dropped out, his plane dropped out of the sky? Or is this really what Putin wants them to believe, exactly the opposite, that Putin ordered his death?
As you can see, there was no any kind of special reaction from Kremlin, just condolences, and that's all. And in Russian mass media, this case is nearly forgotten now, nearly 100% forgotten.
But it's not forgotten for the Kremlin, is it? Because, I mean, they've given regional governors the authority now to establish paramilitary units, which could have a role not only in defending borders, but also attacks from insurgent, anti-Kremlin groups or internal dissent. It's just one of a number of restrictive steps from the Kremlin that appears aimed at preventing another incident like Prigozhin's Wagner uprising. Is the Kremlin afraid that a figure similar to Prigozhin might emerge?
I don't think so, because...
then why would it take those steps?
First of all, Prigozhin was effective. Wagner was effective. It was a real force, well-equipped force, with a real specialist. And what is more important, a lot of military, not openly, but by their minds, have been on the side of Prigozhin. So there was a link between Prigozhin and military. And this link is not existing anymore with any other paratroop, paramilitary units, etc., etc. So the main problem that days was link between Prigozhin and part of the military, who are also unsatisfied how the military operation is going on. Now it's not existing, so it's not a big danger for Kremlin. But what they're creating these groups only in the border regions like Belgorod, etc. They're not creating them in Moscow, in Ural regions, no.
Let's talk a little bit more about Russia's role in the world, because it just rolled out the red carpet for a week-long visit with North Korea's Kim Jong Un. It's thought that Kim either has already or could demand technology that could improve the range of his missiles for nuclear weapons or Russian satellite and submarine secrets. What does Putin want?
If to say very shortly, with Kim's visit, I know North Korea very good for many, many years. In face of Kim, he is receiving a very good, constant troublemaker to the West, mainly for United States, for Japan, which can be useful, very useful in Russian foreign policy. But generally, my evaluation is that for many, many years, Putin is basing his policy on the understanding that the world should follow his rules, but not vice versa.
What the world is concerned about, though, we have to bring it back to that, is that there might be an arms deal that comes out of this. Russia has gone out of its way to publicize Kim's visit, dropping repeated hints about the prospect of military cooperation with North Korea. For example, Russia's Defense Minister Shoigu told Russian media that Moscow is discussing joint military exercises with North Korea.
Yes.
Does Putin not have better cards to play right now than further cozying up with a global pariah state?
But in some areas, this is quite effective. Nuclear, first of all, North Korea is a nuclear state. They have nuclear weapons. Of course,
illegal nuclear weapons. It's an illegal program.
Yes, but I've been many times in North Korea, so I know it. Concerning military exercises, yes, I am sure that next year we'll have triangle military exercises, Russia, China, and North Korea. It's a new bloc, a new kind of alliance which is now formed. Of course, it's first of all, it's not against Europe, but it's, as I said, it's a tool of pressure on Japan and the United States. It's obvious. It's obvious.
But Russia has previously supported international sanctions against North Korea for its unlawful nuclear weapons program. Do I hear you correctly? Are you saying that that does not mean anything to Russia anymore?
Yes, you are correct. Russia will forget about the sanctions.
Isn't this a dangerous game that Putin is playing?
It's a dangerous game.
You're talking about the destabilization of the nuclear balance in Asia and beyond.
Yes, there is a risk because Kim, the current leader, I knew his father, I knew his grandfather. Kim is, in certain way, he is unpredictable. But at the same time, now Russia has some tools to influence on him. Of course, there is a danger. There is a danger of the nuclear war on Korean peninsula. So it's reality. It's reality which was reality as well for last years as well. So I know it.
It's also thought that an arms deal between Russia and North Korea could backfire. South Korea has a big stockpile of more advanced weapons. It might be convinced to give them directly to Ukraine rather than just backfilling U.S. weapons being given to Kyiv. It hasn't given Kyiv arms so far out of fear that it could prompt Moscow to aid Pyongyang. Is that even any part of the calculus from Moscow?
Okay, arms from South Korea is already going to Ukraine via third countries. It's not a secret. Of course, tension will grow. Definitely tension will grow. And I know many people in South Korea who are now saying that South Korea should have its own nuclear weapons as a counterbalance. Yes, it's raising tension. It's raising tension. But it's a big game. It's a big game. I said it's a game which should be a little bit separated from Ukraine case. It's a big game in the Asia-Pacific region. And I said the main thing is Japan and United States.
What is Putin's end game? What is his end game, more broadly speaking, and also specifically in Ukraine? Because if we just look at the figures, I mean, the UN estimates that since the invasion began in February last year, nearly 30,000 civilians have been killed, thousands of Russian soldiers. What can he still hope to achieve?
He hopes to achieve military victory. And,
can he do it?
It depends what we can call the victory. First of all, with the current strategy, military victory is nearly impossible. To change the situation, Russia needs to change its strategy and to turn into total massive strikes all over Ukraine, destroying everything what is existing. But of course, this will lead immediately to the much more isolation of Russia and much more problems for Russian citizens, for economy, etc., etc. That's why there is still a hope in Moscow that Ukraine will not be capable to last long in this war. Russia, of course, has much more reserves. But from my personal point of view, we are now facing a very clear situation that the war will turn into a third year, definitely.
You know Putin for many years. Do you see anything that could bring him to the negotiating table? What could bring Russia to the negotiating table?
At this stage, absolutely not. Putin is the person who will never turn back. If he decided to do something, he will go till the end. For him, and it's position of many experts in Russia, negotiations is a defeat.
With what you just said in mind, there are many who are predicting that the Russian Federation will ultimately collapse because of Putin's war in Ukraine. You served as deputy foreign minister in the early 90s. You've witnessed firsthand the collapse of the Soviet Union. Do you share that view? Is Russia heading for collapse?
No, Russia is not heading for collapse. Russia is heading towards new problems, new troubles. But you should understand one thing. Part of the Russian nation is very much consolidated because they see Putin as a person who saved Russia from possible NATO aggression, from attacks from Ukraine, etc., etc. And this is in the minds of people. And people, a lot of people, many, many people believe in Putin as a person who saved Russia from the aggressive West, from aggressive NATO, etc., etc. And this will work. This will work for coming elections, etc., etc.
We have to leave it there. We have to leave it there. Andrei Fedorov, thank you so much for joining us on Conflict Zone. We appreciate your time.
Thanks. Thanks. I wish you well.